Right, good morning, everyone. My name is Gail Day. I'm the Executive Manager at the Free Market Foundation. Today we are launching the third in a series of 8 booklets titled Laws Affecting Small Business. This series was first published by the FMF in the late 90s. As red tape continues to hinder business, we have updated the series, which deals with finance, health, justice, labor, land, licensing, schooling, and tax. Neil Emerick, who's director and co-founder of a local company called Knightsbridge, will be presenting licensing. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Gail. Yes, good morning, everybody. As Gail said, that this is the third in a series of 8 small publications that sort of look at laws that affect small businesses. And this morning's one, we're going to be talking about licensing. So I thought maybe I'll start with the definition of licensing, and as we find it in the Business Act of 1991, and that is that no person shall carry on any business in the area of that licensing authority unless he is the holder of a license. The Act goes on to say that the issuing authority shall issue a license unless the business does not comply with a town planning requirement or health requirement, or the business is not run by a suitable person, which goes to character or previous conduct. And then one gets into the specifics as laid out in the schedules of the Act. For example, it says that licenses will be required for the sale or supply of meals or perishable foodstuffs. And while this is the staple of licensing regimes generally, Schedule 2 has some wonderful anachronisms which so often happen with acts that become ossified over time. So there are things like a license being required for the provision of massage or infrared treatment, having 3 or more mechanical machines that take coins or tokens for entertainment, keeping 3 or more snooker or billiard tables, and keeping a nightclub or a discotheque, a cinema or theatre. So the purpose of this morning's presentation is to question the philosophy laid out in the current licensing regime and remind us to ask the question, do the benefits of licensing exceed its costs? Are there alternatives to licensing? What is its impact on economic growth, given that by its very nature, it intends to limit economic practice? So to be clear, a dictionary definition of license is an official document from the government that gives you permission to do, have, or own something. So the correlate of that is that if you don't have permission, presumably you're not allowed to do, have, or own something. In the document we are re-releasing this morning, the original was produced in 1997, and unfortunately not much headway has been made since then. We ask again the question, what is licensing for, and do its costs outweigh its benefits? My plan this morning is just to highlight some of the areas where licensing is applied, some of the harms it may bring, how South Africa ranks in terms of its licensing framework, and a summary of the suggestions in the booklet. So I'll start with some of the key uses and arguments against licensing that are highlighted in the publication. So first of all, licenses protect incumbents. When licenses are issued to certain businesses, those businesses will jealously guard their turf. They will ensure the enforcement of licenses is maintained. They will attempt to limit the issuance of further licenses. And all of these measures will aim to limit the number of businesses engaging in economic activity within that sector. Limited supply necessarily reduces consumer choice. So while licenses protect industries, the benefit is not free. It comes at the expense of the consumer. Licenses impose costs on businesses and reduce its productivity. A license application requires time and energy. There may be ongoing requirements to record data in order to remain compliant with the license, which requires management time. While you're busy with license compliance, you're not busy with the business of your business, which should be looking after your customers. That means that licenses affect overall productivity. They are a burden, however small, on the economy as a whole. Some licenses are issued for exploration or innovation. Not issuing licenses necessarily means this exploration does not take place. Possibilities are not investigated. Options are ignored. In June of this year, Roger Baxter, CEO of the Minerals Council, lamented the amount of ministerial discretion over the granting of exploration permits. Where before there was a regime of first come, first served in the granting of rights, he claimed the process appears to have been replaced with a system of discretion, introducing the uncertainty which negatively affects investment. In his claim, we no longer have a competitive exploration framework which would attract greenfield investments. And this is a direct effect of licensing. Our minerals, in the words of one executive, remain in the ground. This leads to a general criticism of licensing, which any framework that relies on the discretion of the issuer is open to abuse. That is, if permission is discretionary, then corruption is not far behind. Money and favours will soon oil the processes of administration to ensure that those members of society less scrupulous than others will be the ones to benefit from a licensing regime. Licenses also impact on the competitive environment that our businesses operate within. Some licenses may be withheld or issued based on the concept of public interest. This is a very vague term and also open to abuse. Competition will necessarily be restricted where administrators believe they are justified in limiting the issue of licenses based on public interest. We should then consider all manner of industrial licensing. There are potential arguments to be made in favour of licensing highly skilled professionals such as doctors and lawyers, but do we suspect that the same conditions should apply to jobs such as real estate agents or financial advisors? Both these industries were devastated in recent years due to onerous requirements on operators. Then we have the licenses that we typically think of being issued by local councils and municipalities. These cover areas of business such as food preparation and sale, sale of goods on streets, retail of alcohol, and so on. Necessarily asking people to jump through these hoops reduces at the margin the number of suppliers in that area or industry and will always hurt consumers. We have all the forms of gambling licenses, which include small restaurants or pubs that might have a couple of slot machines. There is the licensing around horse racing, boxing, and other forms of speculative sports. Do these licenses really add to the safety of the public? One of the more interesting and visible impacts of licenses and license defense was seen in the past few years with the emergence of Uber. Globally, we saw how taxi licenses that cost up to $1 million suddenly lost all value when technology gave people a new and innovative way of hailing transport. Countries around the world have battled to rethink their frameworks, given that customers absolutely love the options that something like Uber bring them. While, of course, we've seen huge protests, some of which have been murderously violent, attempting to stop these innovative businesses making our lives better. Licenses also affect the invisible, such as permission to use resources like radio spectrum. In this country, we've chosen a license regime over a property rights regime for the use and management of scarce resources like spectrum. We can recognise that there might be a requirement with monopoly use for such industries, but to use a licensing regime over a property rights regime is not necessarily a better outcome. With a licensing regime, we may always wonder about the basis for how a license gets issued and how it gets renewed. Under a property rights regime, we can be sure that the license is always in the hands of the supplier that is attempting to get the highest value use out of that resource. If someone else can do better with that resource, then the market will make offers that incentivize the transfer of that resource to a business that can make better use of it. Property rights encourage trade and efficiency, and a license regime has no such beneficial properties. Licenses also involve standardization as they lay down their criteria for issuance. This creates a blandness and a block on economic innovation. If one thinks about the requirements for the regulations around a kitchen that prepares food, and then one thinks about the infinite number of ways that food could be prepared, we necessarily shut down 1,000 possibilities for unique experiences. Standardization can be the enemy of innovation and novelty. The argument for standardization is that it will keep out fly-by-nights from an industry. But one man's fly-by-night is another man's niche product. Standardization is another way of limiting competition. Licenses create black markets, where the issuance of a license becomes overly burdensome. The next best option for a supplier intent on bringing his customers their product will be to bypass the regime entirely, which means society has criminalized his operation. Such actions favor the formal over the informal, and they make criminals of otherwise fairly trading businessmen. Licenses can also be used as sources of revenue, such as TV licenses and, to a degree, driver's licenses. However, if the main motivation behind these is as a revenue source for a particular government operation, there has to be an argument that this is better funded from the general fiscus. Too often, the costs of creating a special revenue collecting framework outweigh the revenue collected. It's not always the right thing to do. And ongoing costs. Licenses often have ongoing compliance requirements. These will always be a burden on the efficiency of a small business and of an economy more generally. So there are the business costs in recording and reporting on license conditions, but there are also the costs created by the existence of the authority receiving them. They have to inspect and process and store this license data. And we've all seen government departments with their paper forms piled up in skyscraper testimony to unthinking bureaucracy. In the booklet, the authors identified 160 small businesses that require licenses, from advocates to veterinarians, from boxers to buffalo breeders. The key theme of this booklet and this morning's presentation is that licenses are not costless bureaucracy. They represent a trade-off between perceived harms avoided and the cost of the supervision required. It does not come free, and there is no such thing as a free lunch. Are we truly sure that the burdens the government lays on us are worth the professed benefits? Is there at least a method by which we may know if a regulation or a license will pay for itself? I'd like to move now to a favourite topic of mine, which is the statistical measurement of government policy in the form of the Economic Freedom of the World report, which is published each year by the Fraser Institute and the Free Market Foundation. So they have a subset of variables which make up part of the overall index and which specifically address business bureaucracy and the administrative and license burdens. So the area is area 5C in the report, and that looks at the costs of administrative requirements. They get their data from the Global Business Competitive Report, which ranks on a scale of burdensome to not burdensome. In 2000, South Africa had a score of 6.9, but in this year's report, our administrative burden score fell to 3.4. That puts us around 90th in the world out of 160 countries. On the bureaucracy cost score, we also do poorly. Again, in 2000, we had a score of 6.5, but this has recently fallen to 3.3, putting us at 120th in the world. The 5C3 metric looks at the cost of starting a business. While the score itself at 8.7 out of 10 seems like a good score, relative to other countries in the world, we're set at 130th out of 160. And finally, the 5C5 score measures license restrictions explicitly. And this data metric comes from the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report and looks at two factors. A is the time required to acquire a license, and B, the money costs associated with acquiring that license. And we currently have a score of 8.4, which in this year's report puts us 87th in the world, which, if it's any consolation, puts us about smack bang in the middle of governments across the world. So in summary, the booklet offers us the following recommendations. One, that licensing laws generally should be repealed. They impose costs that exceed their benefits, and the instinct to license should be replaced by a philosophy that recognizes the trade-off between the benefits sought and the costs imposed. Two, that licenses should generally be automatic upon application, given the satisfaction of objective criteria, and they should avoid any discretionary administrative practice. The owner should be on automatic award, with denial requiring evidence on the balance of probabilities that the licensee would potentially cause harm. Three, a government watchdog should be created, which assesses the creation of new license regimes in legislation and does a cost-benefit analysis, ensuring that the implementation of such a regime clearly addresses demonstrated harms. Four, repeal all licenses that create monopolies or oligopolies. They simply harm the public and raise costs. The telecommunication sector is a great example of this. 5, there should be no vague or discretionary requirements as to the character of a licensee, such as a fit and proper person, or other vague concepts such as public interest. 6, no licenses should actively discourage competition in a regulated industry. So we should look out for laws where administrators decide on whether there is sufficient supply in a given geographic area. A perennial threat is the one that calls for a certificate of need, where the minister decides whether a doctor can work, where a doctor can work, rather than the doctor choosing their preferred location to practice. 7, municipal bylaws should not allow police or officials to confiscate or impound the property of informal traders, including the vehicles they use to bring their produce to market, just because they can't show a permit. This creates a ton of incentives for abuse and the unlawful sale of private property. And finally, we should not require licenses for informal street traders. We should recognize the level of development in this country and acknowledge that these are the best options for some of the poorest members of society. We are not Norway. The street is the only market available to the poor. In conclusion, this booklet remains relevant since its first publication in 1997. It has been updated and is available today as part of the series of booklets documenting laws that affect small businesses. What we hope for is an opportunity to begin a dialogue about licensing frameworks more generally. In 2019, in his speech to the Ease of Doing Business seminar at the World Economic Forum on Africa, the President spoke about making business easier to do in South Africa. He called upon all investors, international and domestic, to act as the necessary catalyst to a thriving and prosperous South Africa. That won't happen if we continue on our current trend of insisting permission is required before a business embarks on its trade. Thank you, and I'm now open to take questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. If anybody has a question, you could either type it into the chat or raise your hand, and Neil will manage the questions. Thank you.
Well, I see there's one question from Zakele, who asks, which industry do you personally think would benefit the most from a removal of a few, if not all, of the licensings? Well, I think recently we had the mining industry, which has a massive impact on our economy. It is still, despite its long history with South Africa, a very relevant industry. And I think those license requirements mentioned by Roger Baxter are, would be the obvious ones to have a look at and see if we can encourage massive capital expansion and investment in the country. And then the other one that's closer to an industry that I'm more familiar with would be the licenses around network providers and broadcasters and other electronic communication platforms. Right at the beginning, the Free Market Foundation opposed that sort of negative licensing, where people were excluded from entering the profession unless they were able to apply and receive a license. That seems, completely inverted. We should say that you get a license unless the government can show demonstrated harm. So I think those are two industries. One would be the old legacy industry, which is still incredibly relevant. And one would be obviously the new industry, which we hope is going to be the platform for innovation going forward.
A question from me, Temba.
Hi,
Are
Temba.
you ready for that, Neil? Not really a question as such, but commenting on the value of the entire collection of the LASB books, Laws Affecting Small Business. It's always from the very first series. It affected me in a positive way, that this is the series of books that should be disseminated amongst all policymakers within Parliament. And I know the figure would be very, very costly. It would run into astronomical sort of figures for this to be done. But it is something that every policymaker needs to have on their desk, so they can see what needs to be done in terms of specifics with regards to getting the economy right and being launched on a higher trajectory of economic growth. This is what is needed, because we should always be mindful of the fact that it is a small business sector that creates jobs. So this is very, very important, especially at a time when we have such high unemployment rates in this country that in some cases are set to be above 50%, above 60% by various analysts and economists particularly. And so I'm just raising the point that so that anyone listening to this presentation by you, if they have deep pockets, they must consider sponsoring the dissemination of the entire collection of this series, The Laws Affecting Small Business. It's very, very important. If people are very serious about launching the country on a high growth economy-based trajectory, this is the book. These are the books that they need to have sponsored, so that all the policymakers can have copies of this, because there are specific proposals, very specific proposals that are non-ideological and that are based on empirical evidence in terms of what will work. This is what the country needs at this point in time. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Temba. I mean, I agree. There are very, very practical examples in all of the books, which are very relevant. But I wouldn't ignore the trying to convey the philosophy as well. I mean, we've had 20 years of economic policy, 25 years of economic policy, where we are now reaping the results of the harm that the Free Market Foundation predicted. I think the government is becoming increasingly aware of the fact that the economic view that they took has ended in sort of failure, and people are beginning to feel it very drastically now. I wonder what it will take to invert the philosophy that the natural instinct to want to regulate or license a business activity. How do we invert the philosophy that says that freedom should be the first choice, necessarily regulated then by demonstration of potential harm, and then the onus being on the government to prove the harm, not the other way around, where restriction is the first default. So that is the true challenge for us to think, is to make the persuasive case that we need to invert our thinking on this.
Neil, might I ask a question? It's Gail.
Sure.
I just wanted to revisit the economic freedom of the world statistics that you gave us, and just confirm that the numbers go up or down, and whether that was good or bad, and what is the trend in South Africa? Are things getting worse in terms of bureaucracy?
Yes, I mean, in the three I highlighted, and I mean, they fall generally into the fifth category, which is regulation of business. We have trended down there over the last 20 years, so that trend is indisputable. Specifically in this morning's theme, I focused on the 5C category. So on the administrative costs of starting a business and bureaucracy costs, we've definitely trended downwards from a reasonable score to something putting us in the bottom 2/3 in the rankings. The licensing score explicitly, we have not trended either way. We've just been very average, very much in the middle, in the sort of 80th out of 160. So we haven't, as potentially commented earlier, since 1991, when the business licensing law was put into place, we really have not done much in this regard. So we've just been suffering this same mentality that business needs to be sort of restricted initially until you have permission to do otherwise.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Neil? I can't see the chat. Neil, are you monitoring?
Say, in the absence of any more questions from right now from anyone participating in this event, I would like to comment very briefly, Neil, on what you were saying regarding the philosophy, selling the philosophy. I think that's the expression that you meant. For myself, I don't see this as a philosophical issue. It's not philosophy. It is just plain commonsensical, empirical evidence that indicates that if you are free to pursue your socio-economic aspirations without that impacting negatively on anybody else in terms of entailing force or fraud, that's not a philosophy. It is a state of affairs. It's reality. And economic freedom is what people want. Everybody, if you were to ask anybody, anywhere, do you want freedom or not? They would say they want freedom. So there's nothing philosophical about that. And so for me, that I see that the strength of these books is based on empirical evidence. You've mentioned the Economic Freedom of the World study, for example. That's an empirical study. It's an empirical study. There isn't anything philosophical about this at all. That's my view, Neil. I'm sorry to bring this up, but
well, yeah, no, I'll take that debate on. It's, I mean, as the Free Market Foundation, necessarily we do engage in the theory and the philosophy of these things, and we would argue moral cases for these levels of freedom as well. I mean, economic freedom, but freedom more generally. However, you do make the excellent point that the purpose of the economic freedom of the world was to demonstrate practical real world outcomes from this theory. So the entire basis for the Economic Freedom of the World report was to take one figure, a measured economic freedom level, and point it to the correlates of things like income levels, health levels, longevity, literacy, education. And very, very practically, they were able to demonstrate that the countries that had more economic freedom objectively had more of the practical outcomes that you've just mentioned. So I think you're right. We can have a philosophical debate about the basis for freedom, but we are now in a position to demonstrate very practical outcomes that politicians can relate to.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Gail. No more questions I can see in the chat.
Neil, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning and for keeping it brief and very much to the point. We do appreciate that. And thank you everybody else for joining us.
At the end.
Sorry, Gail. Eustace is there, I think.
Okay.
Sorry
Eustace?
about that. I just want to read out something from Frederick Bastiat. And this was back in the 1800s. And what he said, he was talking about the fatal tendency of mankind. Self-preservation and self-development are common aspirations among all people. And if everyone enjoyed the unrestricted use of his faculties and the free disposition of the fruits of his labor, social progress would be ceaseless, uninterrupted, and unfailing. Close it.
Here.
I see Gary's also entered the fray.
I just worked out how to raise my hand. Yeah. There's a glimmer of hope on the horizon for certificates of need for doctors' premises. Is that a young acting judge in Pretoria earlier this year struck down all those certificate of need provisions in the National Health Act. They still stand until her ruling is confirmed by the Constitutional Court, which hasn't happened yet. But those certificate of need requirements for medical practices, large and small, may be scrapped.
No, they're a constant threat. You have to sort of play whack-a-mole with those ones because they pop up in so many areas. But that would be great. That would be a wonderful ruling, and a very important ruling on some of the economic rights that we have, where political rights have been well tested. But that would be a very interesting one.
I see Terry has his hand up.
Yeah, by the way, in the early 1990s, the airline industry was deregulated. And I'm not sure if anybody is aware to the degree to which it was deregulated. Literally anybody with enough money can start an airline in South Africa. You don't need any permission other than to show that you've got things like insurance and safety and so on. But there's no economic controls whatsoever. It'd be interesting to debate to say whether it's been good or not. But the problem, of course, is that when you've got a monopoly like SAA, you need to deregulate and privatize. And that wasn't done. And I know we've had debate in the past whether it's better to deregulate and not private without privatization, or better to privatize without deregulation. But that's academic. Anyway, I mean, what I'm saying to you right now is that South Africa has one of the freest, most deregulated airline industries in the world, as far as I know.
Well, they can go further, open up the skies further, then we can allow international airlines to domestically travel in between hops. So we're not bad, but we could do better.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right, again, I'm going to say thank you, Neil. A little flurry of activity at the end there. Really appreciate your time, and thank you to those of you who've joined us. And we will make this available on our YouTube channel shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Neil.